Hello and welcome to Fossils of Montgomery County. My name is Steph Morrisette and I'm glad to present this program on behalf of the Crawfordsville District Public Library. Today we will be learning about some of the more common fossils found along Sugar Creek right here in Montgomery County, as well as one or so that are not quite as common. So let's go ahead and get started with this program. Most of us know what fossils are, that they are the solidified remains of dead organisms, and it takes about 10,000 years before an organism that has gone through fossilization to be considered a fossil. Yet to become a fossil, there are three prerequisites that must be met before a fossil can form. Number one, the organism must contain hard parts, for example, shells, teeth, or bones. Two, it must be buried quickly under sediments to stop the decomposition of the organism. And three, it must be buried in an oxygen-free environment. For example, some of these environments where fossils can form are what are called depositional environments, meaning they are deposited in some form of water body and then covered with sediments such as sand, small pebbles, other materials. And then over time, they solidify as they are crushed under high pressure. And as the sediments cover the organism, it is buried, it goes into an oxygen-free environment as it's buried. If you'll notice these two images here, these are images of plant fossils, which really are not as common as one would think. And we'll be discussing what kind of fossils plant fossils actually are here shortly. This diagram is just a depiction of the depositional environments in which fossils can form. As you see here, there's our body of water where sediments can roll down off the land into the lower part of the water body. You can see there too that as plant and animal matter dies, it is buried under layers of sediment. And then over time, those layers do solidify and become cemented together to form sedimentary rocks in which the majority of fossils are found. So how long ago did these fossils form? Way back in the Paleozoic era, which is around 540 million years ago. Our fossils that were formed here in Indiana, again, I'll mention they were formed in sedimentary rock. And in Indiana, our primary sedimentary rock is limestone. So a lot of fossils that we find right here in Montgomery County are embedded in sedimentary rock like limestone. So where did our fossils come from to begin with? Were they already here in Indiana or did they originate somewhere else? Well, geologically speaking, Indiana wasn't always here. In fact, Indiana, as we know it, was in North America, was actually down near where our current day equator is. And during that time, Indiana was covered, and most of North America was covered by a shallow inland sea. But as continental drift happened and the North American plate began to move away from Pangea, the size and quantity of water that was in that inland sea slowly began to diminish. And again, as continental drift occurred, part of the African continental plate rammed into the North American plate, which actually created the Appalachian Mountains. And as the Appalachian Mountains were formed and all the sediments and rocks were pushed up off the other side of the mountains and into that shallow inland sea, the depositional environment occurred. So all those sediments basically rolled down into the water and sort of filled in the sea. So over time, in fact, over 300 million years ago is when this landmass drifting occurred and the formation of the Appalachian Mountains occurred. So the fossils that we're going to learn about were alive even earlier than that, geologically speaking. Fossils can form in several ways, and there are different types of fossils. Some of the main fossils that we find are preserved remains, which would include organisms that have been preserved in their entirety, including all structural elements as well as biological indicators of life. For instance, an example of this would be amber. Amber is a tree resin that has fossilized over time. Sometimes insects might be caught in the amber, and then as it solidifies over time and becomes fossilized, it actually has been prized as a gemstone. There are replacement fossils, and replacement fossils are formed when minerals actually replace the organic material in the organism and sort of solidifies those remains in a mineral format. Replacement fossils form through the processes of petrification, which others may know as petrifaction. It depends on what term you want to use there. It's also known as permineralization, simply meaning minerals have come in and replaced the organic portions either completely or in portions of those remains. We also have molds and casts that can be made for fossils or that are formed from fossils. This is basically what a mold is let's think of muffin tins. Muffin tins are molds that you're going to pour the batter into. And then as the batter rises, your little muffins are created, and then the muffin itself is a cast from the mold of the muffin tin. Sort of same thing applies to fossil formation. So what happens is there is an imprint in the sediment of the original remains of the organism. But over time, again, that the bone or the teeth or the shell wears away and is dissolved. So no longer are the remains present, but the molded sediments that filled that cast or that complete that cast demonstrate what the organism once looked like. Compression fossils. Compression simply means to compact together tightly. So high pressure can solidify fossils as well. These are more commonly known as trace fossils or ichnofossils. Trace fossils can include multiple different things, and here I've included in my list fossilized nests, which you can see in the image here in the lower left hand or the upper left hand image, the nest with eggs in them. Next to that are worm burrows. So you can literally see where the worms had been moving through the sediments and created these little tunnels. Footprints are also a type of trace fossil. So we can see that humans were present in this image because footprints have been captured in the sediment and solidified over time and cemented through a sedimentary rock to become a fossil. And then finally, we do have coprolites, which is fossilized feces. So what trace fossils are is they record where an organism was, but not recording the actual organism itself. And impression fossils or imprint fossils is the original fossil. It's just a stamp of the original fossil, but no organic matter remains. This is the type of fossil that most plant fossils are known as. Sometimes the words carbon film can be used interchangeably with an imprint fossil or an impression fossil. The most common types of fossils are known as body fossils, and that's pretty much all other fossils besides ichnofossils or the trace fossils. There is also a category of pseudofossils, which are structures of inorganic material that can resemble an organic or biological structure. For instance, we may find a rock that has interesting patterns on the top of it that may remind us of a coral head, even though it's not actually a coral, so it's termed a pseudofossil. Here are multiple images of the molds and casts that we just discussed, as well as petrification. In the upper right-hand image, that is a cast of a shell. Whereas if you look in the lower left-hand image, that is a mold of a shell. And in the lower right-hand image, that is a slice of petrified wood. Again, a couple more examples of molds and casts. The left-hand image, the very far left-hand image, is the cast, and the shell next to it is the mold in which the cast came from. Next to it on the right-hand image, the same thing, and this is a trilobite, which is one of the fossils we're going to discuss today, one of the more rare fossils found in Indiana. So we briefly touched on the fact that the fossil record really goes way back and dives into geologic time. One of the first fossils that we were actually I shouldn't say one of the first fossils, I should say the oldest fossil that has been found actually dates back 3.5 billion years. I'm not sure how the carbon dating goes on that or exactly what method they use to determine the age of said fossils. But the image here on the left-hand side is of a stromatolite, which is a type of bacteria, specifically a cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, even though it's not a true algae. This is the oldest known fossil. And the interesting thing about this image here is you can see the true life image on the left-hand portion of the image, and on the right-hand portion of the image is an artist's depiction of that fossil. What's very interesting to note here is the artistic's rendition of this fossil. This is actually a chain of bacteria that live in a colony as a chain, and it's only 10 micrometers across. If you consider the diameter of a human hair, it's less than that. So it's an extremely small fossil. These guys occurred a long time ago on our geologic time scale, but I wanted to bring to light this diagram showing the different types of fossils that we're going to discuss. A lot of these fossils did die out or become extinct over time, geologic time, due to a variety of reasons, and the ones that we're going to discuss today reflect the brachiopods, gastropods, bryozoans, trilobites, corals, specific types of corals, crinoids, and just a variety of fossils that are commonly found here along Sugar Creek. These images are two that I wanted to bring to light. The fossils of Indiana on the left-hand side. These are fossils that can be found in Indiana and have been found in Indiana. And not only do they include body fossils like bones or teeth or shells, it also includes our carbon films or our impression or imprint fossils like plant matter that we discussed. And then the marine animals, which is the majority of what we're going to discuss, considering that the fossils that we find today were in a marine-like environment when they died and then started the process of fossilization. The image on the right are just examples of fossils that I have personally found. There are some crinoid heads in there. It looks like a couple of horn corals, and we'll discuss these a little further in detail in just a few minutes. A couple slides ago, when we looked at the diagram of the geologic time scale and where some of these organisms lived across the time scale, we're going to focus on those again, and we're going to start with discussing trilobites. Trilobites are related to horseshoe crabs, as you may know, and they're also related to pill bugs, the little basketball bugs that roll up. They're roly-polies, and they're relatively rare to find in Indiana. They were long extinct before the dinosaurs even roamed the earth. Crinoids. Crawfordsville is world renowned for the crinoid beds that have been discovered along Sugar Creek. In fact, collectors would come to the Crawfordsville area specifically to look along Sugar Creek and dig for crinoid fossil plates. Plates simply refers to more than one fossil in a chunk of rock, if you will. If you see the upper left-hand image, that is a trilobite. Right next to it, we see a crinoid. Crinoids are related to starfish and sea lilies, as well as sea cucumbers. Next, we have brachiopods, which is a type of hinged shell organism that we'll discuss, and that is in the upper right-hand image. It looks very similar to our next group of fossils, the bivalves, which are also a hinged shell, but we'll discuss the differences between brachiopods and bivalves here shortly. Now, bryozoans, on the other hand, are an extremely interesting animal. They can be bumpy in nature or resemble a corkscrew. They're plant-like. They also have animal behaviors. These rhizoans colonize together and form a structure that may resemble one organism, but is actually multiple organisms making up that one structure. Many of you may be familiar with gastropods. Gastropods are circular or spiraled shells in the middle right-hand, or in the far left middle right-hand image there. And corals. Corals are probably the most common one found along Sugar Creek, specifically horned corals, which is a type of rugose coral. Horned corals are all extinct now, so only the remnants of these fossils. If you look in the lower left-hand image, that is an image of a horned coral. There are also other types of coral, such as branching corals. There's wasp nest coral, pipe organ corals, even honeycomb corals. So there's just a wide variety of corals that can be found right here in our area. The other two fossils we're going to mention quickly are fossilized wood and Petoskey stones. And I'm going to save that interesting information towards the end of the program. Trilobites. As I mentioned, trilobites were extinct long before the dinosaurs even roamed the earth. In fact, there were 20,000 species of extinct trilobites. Trilobites are arthropods, or were related to bugs as we know them, and we mentioned the horseshoe crabs and the pill bugs. So the whole class of trilobites are extinct. Trilobites were one of the most successful animals to colonize our planet. There was just an extreme diversity. They were able to utilize every depth of a marine environment, from the bottom of the sea and then upwards. They were considered omnivores, which means they just ate everything. So plants, worms, microscopic organisms like plankton, other fish, and even algae. And they could curl up into little basketball-sized balls, which I love that. I wish that we still had trilobites today, but unfortunately we do not. So 542 million years ago are when trilobites basically ruled our oceans. I've included multiple images on this slide about crinoids. 1, because they're really cool, 2, because they're my favorite fossil, and 3, because I want to share all this information with you. Crinoids are an echinoderm, and as we mentioned, are related to starfish, feather stars, sea lilies, sea cucumbers, and there are 660 living species today, most of which live in very deep water environments, and there are 6,000 known extinct species of crinoids. In fact, if I recollect correctly, I was speaking with a fossil collector not too long ago, and this person informed me that of said species of crinoids that could be found, he found 93 different species right here in the Crawfordsville area. I find that astounding. And I have no reason to doubt this man, given his contributions to the scientific community. Crinoids are about 500 million years old. They were and are filter feeders. Most of them used to have stalks in which they would root themselves into the ocean sediments with. Some could crawl using little semblances of feet, but most of them, at least the current living crinoids now, mostly are free swimming. They had a lot of arms, also known as pinnules. They could have anywhere from 10 up to 200, depending on the actual type of crinoid. And along these pinnules, or their arms, they had little mucus-covered tubes that were called podia. And the podia would move that food towards the mouth. So the podia would be on the pinnules. The podia would grasp the food. The pinnule would move the food into the central portion of the crinoid's body, and it would ingest its food that way. Interestingly enough, the arms, or the pinnules, were also function in respiration so this is how they breathe. They use their arms to breathe. And most crinoids are a nocturnal species. Another interesting thing about crinoids is that they can regenerate body parts, And there are both male and female crinoids, so the sexes are different. And the way that they reproduced was that the male and female would release their gametes into the water, at which time the sperm and the egg would unite and fertilize a young free-swimming larva that would find a place to attach itself to the rocks on the bottom of the ocean. Brachiopods, another interesting fossil. They're all interesting, so I may say that every time I talk about a fossil today, but I think that's okay. The first fossil I ever found, I was 6 years old and wading in a creek in my hometown in our local park. And I'd never seen anything like it, but I knew for certain that I had found a fossil of a shell. I just didn't know what it was. Well, I still have that fossil, and it is a brachiopod. Brachiopods are animals that have their own kingdom. Or within the animal kingdom, there are 300 known living species, and most of them live in various regions of the ocean, deeper waters usually. However, there are 30,000 known fossil species of brachiopods, and we'll talk about why there are so many fossil species over so many current living species when you would think it would have the same environmental and evolutionary advantages as the next fossil we're going to talk about, which is a bivalve. We'll get there. But brachiopods, they're also called lamp shells, and that's because they used to resemble old, what's the word I'm looking for? Resembled old Greek lanterns. For some reason, they considered them to look like a lamp, and so they became known as lamp shells historically. The shell has an interesting symmetry that actually cuts between the two halves of the shells. If you look in the upper right-hand image, you can see that that shell looks like it has a point to it. That's called the beak. It has ridges along the top of the shell. Those radiating vertical stripes are known as ribs. And the shell itself, if we look at the top of it, looks like it's been divided down the center. So the shell actually opens one way, but it looks like it's been divided symmetrically another way. The top and bottom, also known as the dorsal and ventral side, they had a grooved depression in the center of them. I don't know if this image does it justice or not, but you could definitely feel the ridge and the depression on the fossil itself. It did have a hinged closure, just like most other bivalves that we think of, even though the brachiopod, because of its ventral and dorsal ridges, became a separate type of species than the bivalve. They were filter feeders. The shell would open using what's called a lophophore, which is a fan-like feeding device that had small ciliated tentacles, which are just little tiny, tiny hair-like tentacles that they would gather food from the water with. And they also used this lophophore to breathe, so it had a dual purpose. Not only did it help the brachiopod ingest food, but it also allowed it to respire in its environment. These guys had a foot, also known as a pedicle, to anchor itself to the floor of the sea. If you look in the lower right hand, the lower image there, you can see that green shell, which is called a duckbill brachiopod. So these guys are still alive today. That long foot extending out of the brachiopod itself. These guys are restricted to marine environments. In other words, if you're going to encounter a bivalve these days, you have to be in the ocean to do that. Bivalves. All of us are familiar with clams and mussels, and this is what a bivalve is. There are 9,200 known living species of bivalves. They're mollusks, which means they're related to today's snails, or excuse me, to today's snails. Their symmetry, however, as I mentioned, is different than that of a brachiopod. So instead of being symmetrical down the central ridge, and they have what's called a left and a right valve. So if you were to open a book, that would be considered the left page of the book and the right page of the book. That's how bivalves open and close. So open and close like a book. And that's how its plane of symmetry was defined. These guys were suspension feeders as well. They filtered food from their environment through the valves or the two different parts of their shell. They were advanced enough to actually know whether they were eating food or feces, and they could spit out those particulates that they didn't want to ingest. They did and do have gills so they could get oxygen from their environment. And the thing about bivalves that differs from brachiopods is that bivalves can be found in both marine and freshwater environments. And due to the numerous varieties of bivalves and the past extinction events that occurred over our geologic time, the bivalves were able to outcompete most brachiopods. This graph here indicates the geologic changes in the populations of both brachiopods and bivalves. The yellow line are the bivalves, and the purple line are the brachiopods. If you look down there in the bottom of the image between the P and the TR, that's the Permian and Triassic periods, there was a large mass extinction there, so you can see where both the purple and the yellow lines dipped down, with the brachiopod, the purple line, taking a significantly larger hit than the bivalves did as far as surviving the extinction. So bivalves continued to evolve more species, whereas the brachiopods actually didn't fare so well. Here again, I was just trying to draw light to the differences and the outward appearance, for sure, of brachiopods and bivalves. The left-hand portion of the image, you can distinctly see that raised ridge along the top of the brachiopod, as well as the ribs, the vertical lines. You can see the beak in some of the images, and then the divot at the other end of the brachiopod. On the right-hand side of the image, there's your typical bivalve. Bryozoans. Bryozoans are fascinating creatures. They're considered what are called a moss animal, meaning because they have both plant-like and animal-like behaviors. They would anchor themselves to the bottom of the sea. They also lived in colonies, similar to corals. There are even some freshwater species of bryozoans. There are 5,000 known living species that occur mostly in tropical waters, with about 15,000 species known only from fossils. The bryozoans fed on plankton, even algae and bacteria, and they did this by sweeping water with, again, their lophophore around their mouth parts. They had also a sticky net of small tentacles around their mouth part in which they would capture food and then turn those tentacles inward into the mouth of the organisms themselves. Many bryozoans that live in freshwater, in fact, all of them form a gelatinous blob, as opposed to a more rigid structure that you might find in a marine environment. If you look in the upper two images, you can see an artist's depiction of what looks like a spiral staircase almost. That is the internal structure of the bryozoan itself. And you can see an actual fossil in the upper right-hand image there of the spiral innards of a bryozoan colony. And the two middle images, the first one on the left-hand side being a close-up of the bryozoan structures with the individual little polyps on there. You can see what look like little fans or umbrellas. Those would be that little sticky net of tentacles that would push food particles towards the mouth of the bryozoans. The middle right-hand image is another example of a fossilized bryozoan community, as well as the lower two images. And on the right-hand side, you see a fossilized bryozoan colony and then a real existing bryozoan, branching bryozoan next to that. And then on the far left-hand side, that is a gelatinous colony of freshwater bryozoans. So distinct differences between marine and freshwater environments with the bryozoans. Gastropods. Gastropods is the largest group of mollusks, and we mentioned they're related to snails. There are so many species of gastropods, 62,000 living species that are currently documented, and 15,000 of those are extinct. We still have a wide variety of gastropods. Some of the gastropods, depending on their species, were scavengers, meaning they pretty much ate everything living or dead, predatory gastropods, which would prey on other living organisms. And then finally, there were herbivore gastropods that solely focused on plant material. The thing about gastropods is they have occupied all marine habitats as well as freshwater habitats, and including some land-dwelling species. In these images you see on the right-hand side, those are examples of two different types of shell formation in the fossils of gastropods. The two lower images is kind of for reference of gastropods today. Corals are the most commonly found fossils in the entire fossil record. These guys are related to sea anemones and even jellyfish. There's an estimated 500 billion species of corals. In fact, there are more corals than birds in the world, and more corals than in the Pacific Ocean than there are trees in the Amazon forest. This is remarkable, and I'm almost unable to wrap my mind around how many varieties of corals there are. Corals were mostly a colonial species that would colonize areas together and build up their outer layers into what appeared to be a single structure, but it was actually multiple organisms living together in one tight-knit environment. Corals mostly got sugars from the algae that is in some of the tissues of certain of certain corals. Algae is a photosynthetic microorganism, basically, and it would be down inside the polyps or the individual corals themselves. If you look in the upper the upper left-hand image, this is a close-up of individual coral polyps that colonized together and formed a larger head. On the right-hand side of that image, that's a fossilized coral head. So that is a colony of a coral head. They also did capture and digest prey. They too had small stinging tentacles that could capture prey and move the algae and other microorganisms to its mouth orifice. And the lower two images are depictions of horned corals. The left-hand lower image has a fossil plate with horned corals in it, and then an artist's depiction of what horned corals were thought to look like. And then the lower right-hand image are actual horned coral fossils. Petrified wood and Petoskey stones. Most of us are familiar with petrified wood, so we'll discuss that now. As we know, with fossil formation, petrifaction or petrification occurs when minerals replace the biologic or organic parts of the living organism, and then the fossil is formed through covering with sediments, covered quickly with sediments in an oxygen-free environment, at which time, over time, the sediments compact and solidify into a fossil. In the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, which is part of the Painted Desert and very near to the Grand Canyon National Park, were a variety of fossilized trees, many of which were coniferous, which simply means they were like our evergreen trees. If you think about Christmas trees or pine trees or spruce trees, even tree ferns that if we look at old illustrations of trees in the past, very large fern-like trees. And then finally, there were some ginkgo trees that have been petrified there. Ginkgo trees are what are known in the dendrological world as fossil trees, because they have remained almost entirely identical in their genetic makeup to their predecessors of over 200 million years ago. In fact, some ginkgo trees that are still around today, in which we do have a hardy variety of them, the oldest known living ginkgo tree is 3,500 years old. So this tells you that it takes a long time for fossilization to occur, and we still have some living fossil trees today. In the lower left-hand image, that's just an example of ginkgo leaves. Many of you may have seen them before, but they were a fossilized tree found in the Petrified Forest National Park. Another interesting thing to note here is in all the other images of the tree trunks or the logs, how colorful they are. And this happens as a result of the different minerals that percolated into the tree itself and then replaced the biological component of the fossil. I really like Petoskey stones. Petoskey stones are really just a type of coral head, and it lived in a colony. What's interesting about the Petoskey stone is that it's compiled of rounded fragments of six-sided corallites. So if we counted all the little white frilly edges, we would get a six-sided hexagonal type of structure. These were called corallites, which are simply a colonial polyp of coral or tiny polyps living together. If you look in the upper left-hand image, the central dark eye in this fossil was actually the mouth of one of those polyps when it was alive. And then the lines radiating out around and away from the eye were tentacles that would move the food into the mouth of the organism. Petoskey stones were originally discovered in Michigan rocks and were named after Chief, let me make sure I get this right, Chief Petasiga, or Chief Rising Sun. Now there's even a city named Petoskey, known for the specific types of fossil rocks you can find in that area. What I really like about Petoskey stones, because I have found them right here in Sugar Creek, that when you find them, generally speaking, they look dry. They look like just your everyday rock. But when they're wet or polished, you can really see the definition pop from the coral head and how it's been preserved over time. One quick note, up here in the upper right-hand image, you'll see a little inset of an image. This is an artist's rendition of what these corals may have looked like when they were alive. We don't know, since Petoskey stones are a fossilized form of coral that we no longer have. And in one of our final images is here, I just wanted to do a quick refresher on the types of fossils that we talked about today. In the upper left-hand image, we have an imprint fossil, also known as a carbon film. These are our plant fossils, which are more, tend to be rare, not as common for sure. In the central upper image, we have a crinoid column, which is composed of multiple segments or individual discs of crinoid. In the upper right-hand image, we have a very large horn coral. In the lower left-hand image, an image of a bryozoan colony. In the central lower image, crinoid sections. Some of you may have heard of Indian beads. In this area, when referring to Indian beads, a lot of people can associate that with crinoid stems. So this is basically just individual little discs of the crinoid column that have broken down over time. They were used as Indian beads, hence as the name may result, as they made jewelry from them. They are also prized by collectors for just their uniqueness, if nothing else. In the lower right-hand image is just a mass of beautiful crinoid fossils that are embedded in a plate. So they actually, the person who prepared this plate probably used like an airbrush to remove a lot of the sediment around it to expose and enhance the beauty of the crinoids themselves. I've really enjoyed giving this program today. Fossils, I consider myself an amateur paleontologist, and this program was important for me to historically bring to light the fact that Crawfordsville in Montgomery County is world-renowned for the various types of fossils you can find in this area, particularly the crinoids. If you would like more information on fossil resources, I encourage you to check out the National Geographic Society, as well as the Paleontological Research Institution, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, and finally the United States Geological Survey. All these sites are a wealth of information and can give you an even more in-depth look at the various fossils that we discussed this evening. Thank you all for tuning in to tonight's program on fossils of Montgomery County. I really hope that this program has prepared you for your own fossil hunt along Sugar Creek. You'd be surprised at how easy they are to find just as you're walking along the shore of the rock beds. If you have any questions or comments on this program or would like another program to be offered, we encourage you to please email us at ask@cdpl.lib.in.us. And we really appreciate your feedback. So we definitely like to hear any comments or questions. And please don't forget to stop by the reference desk on the second floor for your very own complimentary crinoid fossil. You can pick one up and see, hey, I found one of these before, or hey, now I know what to look for when I go on my own fossil hunt. Again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to the next program, which will be in April and will be on Indiana's cave and karst topography. Thanks again for joining us for Fossils of Crawfordsville.